Hello YouTubers, and welcome to my review of Darkest Hour, which is a film which focuses on the first few weeks of Winston Churchill as the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And of course, he led Britain in a time which we were fighting in the Second World War. And it was a very dark time, hence the title of the film, Darkest Hour. Now, of course, the big selling point of this, of course, is Winston Churchill is played by none other than Gary Oldman. And Gary Oldman has done so many films. He's such a great actor, and somehow he has never won an Oscar to this day. This may be the film which wins him an Oscar. I'd be very surprised if he doesn't win the Academy Award for Best Actor after playing this role in this film. He plays an absolutely magnificent role as Churchill. I feel that he's an entirely convincing Churchill. I feel that the makeup which was done on him was absolutely brilliant. We also have quite a stellar supporting cast as well. We have Kristen Scott Thomas, who played Clementine Churchill, who was Churchill's wife. And we also have Ben Mendelsohn, who plays King George VI, who of course is the Queen's father. Now, he plays a good part, although nothing can beat the performance of what Colin Firth did in The King's Speech a few years back, because that performance was absolutely top-notch. It was probably, in fact, it was Colin Firth's best performance in any film to date, and I feel like this is the same in terms of Gary Oldman's performance as Churchill. Now, whether he should have won an Oscar a few years ago is debatable, because he's done many films, and it's quite surprising really that he's never won an Oscar either for a supporting role or for a starring role. But I think this could be the film which does it. Basically what this film is all about, it's about the first month of Winston Churchill as PM. And the way that the film portrays it is a few members of the cabinet, mainly people inside the war cabinet, they don't really want Churchill as Prime Minister, and they're kind of against the idea of Britain actually going into conflict with Nazi Germany, because people like Neville Chamberlain and Halifax, they wanted just some sort of peace treaty with Hitler, but Churchill said no. And so the whole film is kind of like that whole conflict. He wants to go to war, whereas some other members of his own party and his own coalition, they don't want to go to war. And it's really good how that sort of plays out. Whether some of this stuff actually does happen is another thing, because it is based on a screenplay, this film. But I feel like from what I did as a history student, from me doing a degree as a history student, I know that Churchill himself was a very divisive figure in Parliament. I personally think, this is my own personal opinion on the man himself, Winston Churchill was a really good wartime Prime Minister, but after the war he wasn't as good a peacetime Prime Minister, and that's shown because as soon as the war was over they had another general election. Clement Attlee, who was the leader of the Labour Party, actually ended up being Prime Minister after the war had finished. It was only a few years later, in the early 1950s, and when Churchill became Prime Minister again. And that stint wasn't as successful. All around, what I think about this film is it's more or less a masterclass in acting by Gary Oldman. I think that he absolutely gives a really convincing performance. Sometimes I forget that it's actually Gary Oldman, and I think that this is actually a really convincing Churchill. It doesn't make me feel like it is actually acting. It makes me feel like I am seeing Churchill in front of me when I'm watching this. One thing I will say though is it's mainly dialogue, it's mainly acting. And I think maybe if you're into your British history and all of that, this is definitely the film for you. Personally, for me, this is my taste because, you know, I'm really into my history. I really like my British history and I like my world wars and things like that. And I quite like Winston Churchill. He is a national treasure in Britain. Whether you're American or whether you're from another country is another question, or whether you like this film as much as us British may like it. But I think for certain this is a really good film, and this is one to watch, especially in the Oscars race in terms of the Best Actor award, because I think that it's a very tough performance to beat now. If someone else wins the Best Actor award instead of Gary Oldman for this film, then they would have to play a hell of a part in whatever film it is. As for a film which has repeat viewings, I think this is a film that you can revisit, but I wouldn't say you revisit that often, like films such as The Shawshank Redemption or Forrest Gump, or, you know, other films which personally I've watched like millions of times. So overall, that is my review of Darkest Hour. I would recommend you go and see it if you've not seen it before, especially if you are into your history like myself. I think that Gary Oldman, I've said it before, I'll say it again, he gives a terrific performance, as does everybody else in this film. Kristen Scott Thomas gives a good performance, even though she's not in the film that much, but she gives a good supporting role. Also, Lily James, she gives a good supporting role. She's kind of like his typewriter, like his typist basically. She does all his speeches, she types them down, and then he reads the speeches in Parliament and whatnot. And everybody else in this film gives a terrific performance. So this is a great film. I recommend, as I said, I recommend you go and see it. Thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you in the next movie review. Have a great day. Bye for now.